Hey everyone, this is Paul from Thinking Christian, and in this video what I want to do is explain why I am not a naturalist. Now, I actually used to be kind of a naturalist. I was never really a strong naturalist, but I think I accepted naturalism in its more weak form, just assuming that everything would be able to be reducible to scientific explanation, things like this. And as I looked more into it, I realized there were a lot of problems with this view, at least problems with my versions for accepting this belief. And in this video, I'm going to talk about the problems that I see with naturalism. Now, let's define naturalism. The way I'm going to define it is basically the philosophical belief that everything arises from natural properties and causes, and as a result, supernatural or spiritual explanations are excluded or discounted. And often what this means is everything that exists can be explained by science or the scientific method. And as a result, this pretty much always implies atheism, in the sense that God would basically usually would be supernatural or metanatural and can't exist within naturalism. Of course, as we've seen in some of my videos on simulation theology, you can, of course, have a God that a naturalist can believe in if we are in a simulated world. So that's kind of a new can of worms. But for the most part, I think naturalism involves atheism with respect to most theistic gods and religions as a result. So let me talk about my reasons for not being a naturalist. And I'm curious, what are your reasons for being a naturalist or not being a naturalist? And what do you think? So the first reason is just simply that there are no really good arguments for naturalism. When you think about it on the surface, naturalism is often presented as a sort of default position, but it actually makes a very strong claim. The claim that everything can be explained by sort of a mathematical scientific type of description is a very strong claim, and it's very difficult to see how you can actually make this argument, especially given that, we see some things, and some things have a very good natural mathematical type of description, but how can we go from that to saying everything does and these descriptions are all we need? I think the only way you can argue this is by induction, and this is problematic because induction has been unreliable in the past. For instance, Europeans thought that there were no such things as black swans and thought about this for centuries until somebody found a black swan in Australia. This was a Dutch explorer. Once again, there are times induction has been wrong. So it seems as if naturalism is an unjustified leap from the success of many or even some explanations or descriptions of things as mathematical, scientific type of descriptions to saying everything is. And because you can only argue from it by induction, it seems to actually, to some people, commit the fallacy of hasty generalization, where you go from a few examples, extrapolate, and you can't justify this extrapolation. So as a result, we should be skeptical, the first thing, that naturalism is true, given that it can pretty much only be argued by induction. It's not some logically necessary truth to begin with. The other problem here is that the success of our naturalistic explanations can only be explained outside of naturalism. Otherwise, it's circular. So often people come to naturalism because they see the success of scientific descriptions of the world. But as a result, if that's what you say, all we need are scientific descriptions, you no longer have a way of explaining why scientific descriptions are so effective. Otherwise, you would be arguing in a circle. You'd be saying, basically, because our scientific descriptions are so effective, then scientific descriptions are all we need to describe reality, and therefore that's all there is. But then you can't use that to explain why everything has such a description. So it becomes difficult to make that argument. And this is actually the success of our naturalistic explanations. While naturalists use this in favor of naturalism, other people, like many theists, use this as arguments against naturalism. They basically say, look, for the universe to be rationally intelligible, for our mathematical descriptions to be consistent and be so easy for us to understand, it seems to imply that naturalism is false, that mathematics is so effective that it almost seems like it was designed to be rationally intelligible by rational minds. So that's one thing to look at. The evidence that's taken to basically argue for naturalism by induction is actually taken as arguments against naturalism by many theists and mathematicians. And then you end up having randomness and quantum mechanics that end up undermining naturalism, because the problem here with this is naturalism might have made a lot more sense when you had Newtonian mechanics, where basically everything is describable by this Newton's law of gravity, things like this. But now with our quantum mechanical picture of the world, we actually have quantum indeterminacy. We actually have randomness. And the problem with randomness is we can only quantify the uncertainty. We can't actually give a perfect description, which is what people maybe a couple hundred years ago assumed we would eventually be able to do. And randomness is a problem to naturalism because what is the randomness itself? What is actually causing this randomness? We have a mathematical description of what the actual amount of randomness is, but we don't actually explain what gives rise to it. And this is, I think, something to be very careful of. Let's not confuse a naturalistic description or a mathematical description of a phenomena from an explanation. We can describe the law of gravity mathematically based on how it behaves, but that's not really a metaphysical explanation as to why it behaves this way. It's just basically saying we can use this to predict certain things. So going from this, how good our predictions are in many cases, to saying that offers an explanation seems to be a category error. And as a result, because naturalists will be able to give explanations constrained by their a priori assumptions, we should actually expect them to be able to do pretty well. We should be expecting naturalists to do the best they can at giving a good naturalistic explanation for everything we see. The question is not whether or not they can do so and do so effectively. The question is whether their a priori naturalistic assumptions are good, true, or representative of reality, which is what we're going to be skeptical of, or what I'm skeptical of. And then lastly, I would say there's this idea that you often hear that's basically in favor of naturalism. Look, everything's been in one way. We've been defying scientific explanations of everything. Give me an example of one thing that has defied a naturalistic explanation. And I will give 4 examples that have come up actually due to research probably in the last 100 years. First is morality. Naturalistic explanations for morality actually undermine their truth, and I will talk about this a little bit later. Naturalistic explanations for mathematics have difficulty explaining the applicability of mathematics and the ability for our minds to reason in this very abstract way and come to sort of what we assume to be truths about the world by pure thinking. This is, I think, a surprise under naturalism. Just reason itself, logical truths, how are these kind of natural things? If we want to expand the naturalistic bubble to start encompassing these things, we can then start actually asking, what do we mean by naturalism? But we'll talk about that later. And then the last has come up is actually philosophy of information. Information seems to be this third quantity. Often people say, you have mind and body, or you have physical substance and then mathematics or descriptions, but information being its own thing. And what is information? How do we find a naturalistic explanations for the presence of information and sequences and these sorts of things? That's its own thing that becomes an issue. These are challenges to naturalism that have gotten bigger over the last 100 years and then gotten smaller. So I think it's misleading to say, oh, we've only gone in one direction, debunking traditional supernatural explanations for things. Yeah, there have been plenty of things that we have had supernatural explanations for that now we have a naturalistic explanation for, and perhaps the weather is an example. Sometimes some people in some societies used to think, lightning was like Zeus's wrath or something like that, but now we understand that, clouds cause this, but for many things, we need to be careful we're not just pushing the problem back. The second reason I'm not a naturalist has to do with free will. And what I would say is naturalism tends to undermine our experience of free will, which we have firsthand experience with. For instance, when I pick up this phone and I drop it, I have the experience that I'm actually causing this phone to drop by opening my hand, or I'm actually not causing the phone to drop, because we would argue maybe gravity describes this, but I am causing my hand to open. My mind is sort of doing this. And under naturalism, there's no room for our minds to actually have any causal power over the world, because once again, everything can be explained by natural laws. So there's no room for our minds to actually be sort of prime movers in a certain sense. And for free will to exist, our minds basically need to have causal power over the world to a certain sense that in many ways can't be reduced to just the impersonal naturalistic explanations that we often get from naturalism. And I would argue, it's far from clear that our conscious experience of free will can be explained by some sort of naturalistic reductionism. Perhaps a naturalist can give a good naturalistic account for it, but whether this is the best account, of course, isn't going to be something we can assume naturalism to be able to argue. And what I'd say with this is basically, I'll believe it when I see it. If the naturalist is going to argue they can predict my behavior based on a good enough simulation of natural laws and the laws of physics and these sorts of things, I would say, go ahead. If you can predict it, perhaps I would change my mind. If you can basically show me a video of what I'm going to do reacting to something, and I react exactly the same way as a video that you've generated, yeah, that would be very good evidence to argue that we don't really have any free will. But until I see evidence like that, I think I'm justified in at least being skeptical of this sort of naturalistic meta-narrative about free will. And yeah, the point of this is basically the naturalist has the burden of proof to show that our experience making choices, which we assume, I think most of us assume we have at least some degree of control over our choices, is actually an accident, is actually just an illusion. And I think it's far from clear that that's the case. The third reason I'm not a naturalist is actually that naturalism is self-defeating with respect to epistemology. And the argument goes like this: if naturalism is true, my cognitive faculties were produced by a non-truth-seeking mechanism. If natural selection is all there is, which basically if naturalism is true, then natural selection is the only thing you can account for the development of mind and how we are today, then basically the argument goes that our beliefs and our cognitive systems were built by a non-truth tracking process. And as a result, we should doubt the results of our mind or reason. This goes back to Darwin's doubt, because these things were not selected by a truth tracking mechanism, which includes us being skeptical of any results we have on the basis of reason, which of course includes naturalism itself, which is the argument that naturalism is self-defeating. Now, some naturalists will argue that truth is conducive to survival, so as a result, one should believe in true things, and as a result, natural selection does select true beliefs, but it's unclear that that's actually the case. And the reason I say this is because there have been many beliefs that the naturalist is going to argue that we developed due to natural selection that were basically only there for a survival value. For instance, the naturalist is going to basically accept naturalistic explanations that explain away our belief in morality or religion. So as a result, we can basically take this argument and turn it on the naturalist themselves and basically say your belief in naturalism is in the same way, puts you in the same cognitive position as you're arguing religious beliefs hold. It has some survival value to you, and it's not necessarily true. Once again, you're creating an undercutting defeater that causes them to distrust these results. And then the last thing about this when it comes to epistemology is one doesn't basically choose or reason themselves to naturalism itself, because once again, there's no free will under naturalism, and epistemology is tricky. These are basically illusions of choice, and reason that's dubiously explained as an accidental byproduct of nature becomes something difficult to account for. And as a result, you can't say naturalism is a position one reasons their way to if one doesn't have any control over what, doesn't have any ability to react to certain evidence and use their mind as a sort of causal thing to consider different evidences. So it gets to be very difficult, right? To basically say, if naturalism is true, why should we trust our cognitive faculties that lead us to think it's true? And we'll talk about that more in a minute. The next one that I want to talk about is that naturalism undermines moral realism. Now, this is more of an argument from experience, but basically, if naturalism is true, our moral beliefs are illusory. And if naturalism is true, there's no room for these sort of ought-type claims or notions of moral obligation that are required for moral realism to be true. So there are no such things as ought, and as Hume argued, you have an is and an ought distinction. You can't get an ought from an is. Science can only describe what is, you can't describe what ought to be. So when we use the words like right or wrong, we're actually referring to things that we ought to do, obligations that, things should be a certain way or somebody should not do something else. And if naturalism can't account for these ought type of things, for instance, how would you basically come up with some sort of experiment to determine whether you ought to save a drowning child or not, then we should be skeptical if naturalism is true, that any of our moral beliefs have any truth. And I kind of follow in the footsteps of Thomas Nagel to say, yeah, if this is the conclusion of naturalism, then I don't think naturalism is all that satisfying. And as atheist Kai Nielsen said, we can be more confident that things like child molesting and wife beating are wrong than any skeptical theory that says we can't really know these things reasonably, or if naturalism is true, that these things are just meaningless statements. And of course, to all the naturalists like Michael Shermer who still hold out for a naturalistic explanation of morality that doesn't undermine moral realism, which I should mention has failed again and again over the past several centuries. You can look at books like After Virtue by Alistair MacIntyre, who really, I think, does a good job of explaining this. Also, Science in the Good, James Davison Hunter and Paul Naliski, another great book. The question still remains to people like Michael Shermer, if a scientific experiment could be demonstrated, and the result of this experiment said it was morally obligatory to sacrifice your child or do something you might find morally outrageous, would you do it? I mean, would you do it if the scientific experiment said it is true that you should sacrifice your child? You kind of have the sort of Euthyphro dilemma, but you can pose it to the naturalist who is a moral realist to make the argument that even if it was the case, which of course I and many philosophers are very skeptical that moral realism and naturalism are compatible, but if they were, and we came to this knowledge as a result of the scientific practice, which is the assumption of naturalism, would you do it or not? That's the question. And then the fifth reason I'm not a naturalist is, and this is an interesting one, is that there's actually no clear definition of naturalism. If you think back to what my definition was, right, the philosophical belief that everything arises from natural properties and causes and supernatural or spiritual explanations being excluded or discounted, notice how we're just pushing the question back to what we mean by natural or supernatural. Similarly, if we say everything can be explained by science, we now get into the weeds of the demarcation problem. What differentiates science from pseudoscience? And I should mention, a lot of philosophers of science have given up on the demarcation problem, at least in its simplistic sort of form, because it's very difficult and you get all of these sorts of edge cases. So part of these problems is you get into things like reason, consciousness, look at some of the work of David Chalmers, and mathematics. Whether these things can actually be accommodated by naturalism is actually up for a debate. So suppose for a second that mathematics has a non-natural basis. So you could be a mathematical Platonist. You could think that just, numbers exist in this abstract realm. Or as some theists argue, you could believe that numbers are basically ideas in the mind of a deity like God. If this is the case, right, then any naturalistic description that you come up with, a naturalistic description that invokes mathematics actually breaks metaphysical naturalism because it assumes things that would be in violation of metaphysical naturalism itself, right? It would presuppose the existence of something that would undermine itself. Same thing with mind. If our consciousness can't be reduced to naturalistic means, or same thing with reason, to things that are metaphysically natural or allowable by metaphysical naturalism, then naturalism would be self-defeating. And as Barry Stroud points out, he has a paper called The Charm of Naturalism. He basically points out there are strong disagreements as to what counts as nature, and, quote, those disagreements are not themselves to be settled by what can be recognized as straightforwardly naturalist means. So one thing that seems not to have been naturalized is naturalism itself, end quote. So Stroud poses a dilemma, and I'll kind of put it in my own words. Stroud says it like this. Either naturalism is inclusive or exclusive, meaning it's either restrictive and fixed or it's not. If naturalism is inclusive, then it is not definite. It is loose and it might let in entries that are usually labeled as supernatural. And if naturalism is exclusive, then it distorts and denies the very phenomena it is supposed to study. Thus, naturalism is either open to the supernatural or it is not capable of giving us an accurate, comprehensive account of reality, which means that there is more to reality than nature. Once again, if naturalism is true, where does the justification for naturalism come from under naturalism? I think this is one of the things that he's getting at. So look up Stroud's dilemma, check out his paper, The Charm of Naturalism, which is really interesting. And the last reason, this is kind of a bonus reason, I'll say number 6, this comes down to Kuhn's dilemma, which comes from Robert C. Kuhn's in his paper, The Incompatibility of Naturalism and Scientific Realism. Basically, he says, if natural science is accurately telling us about the nature of reality, then naturalism is false. This, of course, would not be acceptable to a naturalist. On the other hand, if natural science is not accurately telling us about the nature of reality, then naturalism can be true, but not in its ontological form, which of course brings us back to the first point that we had to say, right? If natural science is accurately telling us about the nature of reality, how is it possible that we could know this to be true under the constraints of naturalism and the assumptions of how our cognitive faculties evolved given a non-truth tracking process? So, anyway, these are my reasons for not being a naturalist. I'm curious what you think. I think the main reason that started tearing open the whole hole for me when I was a naturalist was the moral realism piece. But of course, some of these other reasons I think came up as I started learning more about it and learning more about flaws and my reasons for being a naturalist. But if you're a naturalist or not, I'm curious to hear what you think and let me know. All right, have a good one.